Good evening. My name is Joe Hanlon, and on behalf of the Cranford JCs, I'd like to welcome you to our presentation on mental health awareness and suicide prevention. This evening's presentation and discussion is the beginning of conversations we plan on hosting regarding mental health, the signs, effects, coping mechanisms, and ultimately instilling hope. These sessions are being held in memory of our longtime member and friend, Jay Manning, who committed suicide tragically earlier this year. Ideally, we would love to be hosting these sessions in person and talking live with all of you, but for now, we'll have to make do virtually for the time being. Our presentation this evening will be in two parts. The first part will be a formal presentation provided to us by Dr. George Scott, a well-known family therapist here in New Jersey and statewide coordinator for the Traumatic Loss Coalition. Dr. Scott will review with us what trauma is and its effects, to caring for our families and ourselves, as well as an understanding of the trauma of suicidal behavior. Following Dr. Scott's presentation, Detective Sergeant Matt Nazzaro from the Cranford Police Department will share with us a list of resources available on those topics. Following Detective Nazzaro's discussion on those resources, we will close out the formal presentation, which is being recorded, thankfully, by TV 35 for future viewing, and enter into part two of our program. Part two of our program, we will provide a Zoom meeting link at the end of our conversation here in the chat room, in the visual here, as well as on our website, where you can join us again for an interactive, non-recorded question and answer session with Dr. Scott and those of you who'd like to learn more and have a more meaningful and deep question and answer session with Dr. Scott. So again, I want to thank you all for joining for, like I said, the beginning of many conversations around this mental health crisis that we're experiencing across our nation within our community. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. George Scott. Dr. Scott, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. It's a difficult topic, but I am honored to be invited back to Cranford, where I have been several times before on a variety of topics, both within the school system and within the community. So to be invited back is like I said, is an honor for me. I have some slides to guide the conversation this evening. If we can put those up, Andrew, let's begin with that. I want to begin with that first slide that says, back up if you would, please. Taking the conversation out of the shadows. That is a huge message this evening. That says that when we get more comfortable with talking about mental illness, mental health, wellness, suffering and struggle, when we can talk more openly about suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior, when we're able to do that, the conversation comes out into the light and more people are healthy. It's when it's in the shadows, it's when we're afraid to talk about it that things really get much more difficult and we struggle much more. The next one, please. So you are not alone. None of you out there are alone. Community is wonderful. In fact, the more connected you are, both within family, whatever that looks like, within your neighborhood, whatever that looks like, or within the greater Cranford community, the more you're connected and attached and you feel less alone, the healthier you are. And that's the balance that we're going to be looking for tonight. Difficult topic, but built on hopefulness. Next, please. This slide kind of is a representation that says we can be fooled because we all have two stories, an inside story and a mask that we wear, which is the outside story. And many, many times, whether you're young or older, in school or out of school, the mask can say what all of those masks say. But what we know is the inside story can be either happy or sad, or very sad, depressed, or suicidal. So we don't want to get fooled by sometimes that mask. The next slide, please. It's the same way with words that are said. Sometimes you check in with somebody and say, hey, how are you doing? And they say, outside, I'm fine. But inside they're saying, I'm not fine. Please help me. They may say, go away, but they really mean, please stay with me because I don't want to be alone. They may say, I promise I'm better. But what they really want to tell you is, I've never been this bad before. And some of the other topics there are, for instance, I Already Ate talks about eating disorders. I'm Just Cold talks about how our young people will wear long sleeves to cover up the scars or the cuts from their self-injury. So it's a difficult, complicated topic, but let's get into it so we can understand it. Next, please. I'm going to group my comments tonight in 3 parts. This number 1 is right from your heart. That is never far apart from our work. Either my work with the Traumatic Loss Coalition, my work in my practice here in Mercer County, nor your relationships with each other. We shouldn't be afraid of the heart connection. I'm also going to talk about the head, the things that we need to think about, the things that we need to know. And then we'll finish up with the how. So what do I do, George? Now what? How do I take this information and how do I help create a healthier community? Next. So we want to make this conversation personal. There are many, many, many of you in the community that are tuned in, but I want to make it personal because actually I'm just talking to you. I'm talking to you with your suffering about yourself. I'm talking to you about your suffering about a partner or a spouse. I'm talking to you about your worry about one of your kids or your grandkids or your godchildren, or just somebody you know in the community that your gut says, I'm worried. So let's make the conversation personal. Next. So we know that the information and the conversation about suicide can be troubling. It can stir up a lot of feelings that we're having. And it's really important for not only me, but it's important for all of us in the planning team to make sure that this evening and the next hour, you feel safe, emotionally safe, physically safe. And then if you begin to be overwhelmed by the emotion of it, grab some water. Get up from your seat and just stand up. That helps. Take a few deep breaths. That helps. Do the things that you need to do because you're not alone, and we want you to be okay because your well-being is very important. Let's proceed. You know, here's something really interesting about us as adults and us about caring adults. You know, as adults, we know that bad stuff happens. We know that the end point of our living is dying. And you know what we do when death happens? Caring adults step in. That's part of the ritual of how we get through difficult times. We do our best to explain, we give advice, we try to soothe those that are left behind. Family, friends, we gather together at homes and synagogues and churches. We gather together to provide solace to each other, to support each other, and to provide assurance. However, next. When deaths such as accidents and illnesses happen, that's what we do. We acknowledge it. We go public with it. We stand up for it. However, the next slide. In matters of death by suicide, that support may not be forthcoming because of our individual discomfort with the topic, the stigma associated with suicide and mental health. And as a result of that, many times those who suffer more alone than they normally would. Next slide. When you begin to understand your own attitudes about suicide, your biases perhaps, how you respond to the thought of suicide, the more you understand you, then the more you become emotionally, psychologically available to a family that is suffering from suicide, from a friend who is suffering from suicidal thinking, or from a colleague at work. So we want to be able to open ourselves up to understand more about this. Next. So we're still up here in the head, and here are some really key concepts. Suicide is very complex. It's not cause and effect. It's not because of this, someone died by suicide. It's not because of that, someone took their own life. And if we're talking here about the age span, across the age span, this is particularly true when we're talking with adolescents about suicidal thinking, or if they've lost a loved one to suicide, because they have a tendency to want it to be cause and effect. He died of suicide because she broke up with him. She died of suicide because she got a bad grade. It's because someone lost a job. It's because they got bad news. That could be a factor, but there are multiple factors. Certainly, mental health distress is a key risk factor, and we'll talk about that. Life stressors can play a significant role in suicidal thinking. It's not in isolation. Remember, it's complex, and I'll show you how complex it is, but it's not a single cause and effect. Next. So before we get into the complexities, let's talk about some common language. When I use the phrase suicidal ideation, what we mean there is some human being is thinking about wanting to die. They're contemplating it. Suicidal behavior can be anything from researching it. Many times people will go online because they want to find out about dying. Usually it gets complicated because they want to die without pain. They want to die quickly because of just turmoil that they've been suffering with. Non-suicidal self-injury is in there because that means this. Sometimes we get scared when usually one of our adolescents uses cutting as a self-injury, headbangs as a self-injury, burns themselves as self-injury, punches walls when they're really angry as self-injury. They are non-suicidal self-injury behaviors. However, we need to pay attention to it. Those behaviors seek relief on a temporary basis. Suicidal behavior looks for permanent relief. A suicide attempt is a non-fatal, self-directed effort, a behavior that someone does to die, but they live. And then ultimately what we have is suicide, which is a death that's caused by a self-directed behavior. Inside all of those ideas, significant emotional pain, significant hurt, significant sadness and sorrow that they're not able to remedy. Next. We're still in the head here. You know, suicide is one of the world's greatest public health issues, and I want to commend Cranford tonight for this. You know, suicide is not a school behavior if the person who dies was in school, or it's not just that family, but it's a public health issue. And there, across the world, and certainly in the country, an accumulation of deaths. Next. It's the leading cause of death. It's the number one cause of injury, mortality, more than motor vehicle accidents. The last one, every 13 minutes, someone dies by suicide. Now, here's a caution. Not everyone is suicidal. Not everyone who's in a bad way is suicidal. And not everyone who thinks about dying actually acts on it and dies. I don't want anybody to think it's a pandemic like the virus. It is not, but it is big, it is personal, and we need to know about it so we can pay attention to it. Next, please. So when I say it's a public health issue, that means it involves all of these folks. Now, I don't know who's on this webinar this evening, excuse me, but I'm thinking that in your personal life, you're on it because personally you're relating to it. But in your professional life and that other things you do could be any one of these things. Everyone here on this list needs to know about suicidal thinking, suicidal behavior, and how we can both prevent it and intervene. Next. This is information. This is the most recent data from 2017. And it's across the country. And you can see across the top of that chart are age groups. What we want to focus on for tonight's purpose is green, because green are the suicidal behaviors. And what you can see is in that first green box, the age group is ages 10 to 14. It is the second leading cause of death among our children, ages 10 to 14, as well as 15 to 24. So now we're in school, graduating, promoting out of school in the early workforce or college. And it's also the leading cause of death for our young adults. So is it significant? Very significant. And that's here so that we don't have a bias of thinking we know who those folks are by age who want to die. We can see that age span. Now, when we go to midlife, that 35 to 44, you can see that it drops to the fourth. Same thing with the 45 to 55 or 54, and then it becomes less so and less so. However, let me make this point. We should also be concerned by our senior citizens, our parents and grandparents who find themselves isolated, who find themselves sad because those around them are dying, who feel that they're just a burden, because those emotional feelings actually contribute to suicidal behavior in our seniors, our moms and dads, and our grandparents. So we need to pay attention to everyone. Next slide. 45% of people who die by suicide have visited their primary care physician in the past 30 days. So what? Well, it seems to please go back to that other slide. What it seems to say is that even though you've been in front of a professional physician, the family physician, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, any other physician, even though you've seen your primary care, the questions are not asked, and by many physicians, and therefore the clues are not there. Next slide. Up to 67%, 2/3 of those who have attempted suicide have received some type of medical attention recently, usually in the ER. However, the question remains whether or not that person who wound up with medical attention ever shared the fact that it was suicidal thinking or suicidal intent, or was asked, with everything that you say is going on, are you having thoughts of taking your own life? Those questions still are not asked, even in our medical community, but we're getting better. That's a good sign. Next. This is a 2015 research data. 40% of those who died had a history of diagnosed mental illness. So they presented with behaviors, they saw a psychiatrist, they were in a rehab, they went to a crisis center. 40% of those were diagnosed with some type of mental health issue. However, more than half of those people that were diagnosed more than half of the people had no formal diagnosis. Let me see if I can boil that down, because I just confused that a little bit, and I apologize. Whether it's a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health illness, it can still lead to a suicide death or an attempt of suicide unless we understand what we see and what we hear. And that's really the heart of tonight. Next. I'm going to introduce you briefly to something that's called adverse childhood experiences. This is particularly true whether you have young children in the house or adolescents, or it's particularly true to you, and I'll explain that in a minute. Now about 20 years ago, when I was in my last school district, which was South Brunswick in Middlesex County, not far from where you folks are, I was the director there, and during the time I was there, we had several of our active students die by suicide. And about the same time, there was a group getting together in New Jersey called the Traumatic Loss Coalition. What they were saying is we don't have an organized way of intervening, of doing suicide prevention, and also of doing suicide postvention, where we help survivors in order to prevent further suicides. And during the time that I was doing this work, I came across this research project from the 90s that talks about how early childhood experiences of traumatic events or high toxic stressors, they're common, and they create health problems, physical and emotional. Next slide. Here are these adverse childhood experiences. So I want you to take a look at that list from your adult perspective and your own growing up life, or from the life of children in your nest that you're raising, to see whether any of these or several of these events exist. Because what we know now is the more of these events that exist in a child's life, the more they are then their whole trajectory of wellness is taken off course, where they begin to get physical illnesses and emotional illnesses. Next slide. ACEs is categorized in these 10 circles. So the first column you see is abuse. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. If any of those events are in your life growing up between your birth and age 18, you get a 1 for each category. Neglect, if you had neglect in your life, you get a 1 for each category. And we begin to add up the number of adverse events that were in your life. And then there are these other 5 called household dysfunction. Did someone in your home, in the nest, have a mental illness, diagnosed or undiagnosed, that because of it, it created a turmoil or a chaos or a tension? Did you grow up in a family where you bore witness to the maternal figure being abused? Did you watch your mom, grandmom, foster mom, the maternal figure, did you watch her get verbally or physically abused? That would be another 1 on the scale. Did you come from a family where there was a divorce? Another 1 on the scale because of the disruption and how it affects some children. Did you live in a family where someone in that household went to prison or went to jail? Did someone use either street drugs or script drugs at all? 10 adverse experience types. Let's see how they impact us in the family, and what does that have to do with suicide? Next. Of the 17,000 people in the study, 25% of them had at least 3. They're very common. And when you have 3, it increases your risk of chronic diseases. It increases your risk for asthma. It increases your risk for diabetes, heart condition, gastrointestinal condition. When we carry the results of these events in our bodies, then they begin to affect us physically and emotionally. They also are the beginnings of some cancers. You are 3 times more likely to develop a cancer in your body if you have 4 or more of those ACEs. And we'll talk about depression, and we'll talk about substance abuse. Next, please. If you have 4 of those, this is the tie-in that brought my work into the TLC and suicide prevention. With just 4 of those 10 categories, your risk of suicide increases 1,200% over somebody that had a 0. That when we're not able to reconcile the turmoil that gets created in us, the social, emotional turmoil that we hold on to, then we begin to look for relief, and ultimately we look for permanent relief because it overwhelms us. Next. If we could eliminate those 10, then what you can see here is that your work productivity will go up 61%, because it prevents us from going to work, from being regular attendance at school or work. It would decrease suicide and life dissatisfaction by 67%. And then over here, if we could eliminate it, then anxiety could be reduced by 56%. Abuse and neglect in all of its forms, in all of its chronic nature, in our babies between birth and 18, has a significant negative effect on outcomes. Next. It's preventable. Even if you've got a score of 4 or more, just knowing that, and we'll talk about self-care at the end, just knowing that you can offset the negative effect. There are particular things and specific things you can do to calm this body and calm this mind. So suicide is preventable, generally preventable as a public health problem. Next, please. Here are the risk factors. You can see how complicated they are. I don't need to go over all of those. We've talked about many of them. So what you can see is suicide is complicated, and it has its origin way before the person begins to act on their suicidal thinking. And we begin to see it in other behaviors, and that's what we want to pay attention to. Now, I just want to say to the JCs about this, and particularly to Joe, you folks have my PowerPoint. If you would like to post that somehow so that people have access to it, or they can email you and you can email them a copy, please feel free to do that. That way they can go back and they can look at the things and to remind them of what they need to do next. There are such things as community risk factors. For instance, in some communities, if you have easy access to guns, you increase risk. If you have easy access to drugs and alcohol and prescription drugs, think about opioids, you increase risk. And when you increase risk, you increase risk of suicidal thinking. Community risk factors are, if your community, if the greater Cranford community is just too uncomfortable having conversations about mental wellness, then that's going to be a risk factor for the members of the community, young and old. If there are no services in Cranford, and I know there are, and we'll talk about services later, but if you don't have access to services, perhaps because of insurance, increases your risk. So there are things that can happen within a community that also contribute next. Here are some more. Incarceration is a risk factor. Hospitalization can be a risk factor. As a matter of fact, let me share this with you. If one of your loved ones or you had to be hospitalized for mental illness, for mental wellness, then when you're released, the next 30 days are a high risk period. Think about it. When you're hospitalized, you have the opportunity of counseling, people paying attention to you 24/7, not having access to alcohol and drugs. And just 30 days out, you can actually be at higher risk because you rush back in without being healed enough. Next, please. Increased risk factors. If you or somebody that you know has had a prior suicide attempt, they are 40 times more likely to try again than somebody who has never attempted. And then these are the mental health issues, the depression, drug abuse, the bipolar disorders, the schizophrenia, alcohol abuse, eating disorders, higher risk of suicidal thinking and suicidal effort. Next. Here are some risk factors that we see in behavior. People who are irritable regularly, angry all the time, or hostile. People who do use and resort to self-injury, they are risk factors. Extreme sensitivity, they get overwhelmed, shut down from rejection or failure. Physical complaints about illness, have them checked out. Many times they have an emotional beginning. There's the absences from school or work or the tardies. It's a red flag risk factor. And a decrease in work performance or a decrease in school performance, where somebody is functioning pretty well and gradually you see them over a short period of time decrease, risk factor. Next. Here. Now, these are warning signs. These are red lights. See, I consider risk factors as the yellow light that says, oh, please pay attention and follow up. Warning signs are pay attention and follow up now. Next. So what we can hear is people who talk about wanting to die. That's a real warning sign. You know, a lot of times kids will use the pejorative, I just want to kill myself, I just want to die, I just don't want to be here anymore. And sometimes families or adults or teachers or other adults in the community will say, they're just trying to get attention. They say that all the time. Pay attention every time. Every time. If they use that phrase, I'm going to kill myself to get attention, let's give them other language they use to get our attention. But let's pay attention to it. If they feel they're a burden, if they feel trapped, if they're ashamed or humiliated to a significant regular extent, unbearable emotional pain. If you know folks in that piece, we need to connect them to help. Next. Shutting down, isolating. I worry about this with our adolescents. We could do a whole other commentary about the effects of COVID and the shutdown on people in homes. But when you isolate too much, when you're disconnected too much, you're much less healthy. If you sleep too little or too much, you're much less healthy. If you call to say goodbye, and unfortunately with that, other people may not know that. It's kind of like, why are you calling me? Follow up. Are you having thoughts of dying? Are you okay? Are you having thoughts of taking your own life? Giving away prized possessions, being extremely aggressive, all red light warning signs to stay close to that person. Next, please. Click the next slide. These are statements that are, you don't wonder what the person is thinking. I'm going to end it all. I wish I were dead. Pay attention to that. The ones on the right that just came up, they're less direct. They're nuanced and subtle. But pay attention. Pay attention when your gut says, I'm worried about this person. Next. Contagion is this emotional phenomenon in which a suicide attempt or a completed suicide can have a negative effect on other people. Its exposure to suicidal behavior could influence others who are vulnerable to also think about dying. Having known somebody who dies by suicide increases risk. It doesn't predict another suicide attempt, but what it does say is when you're that close, then what happens is you begin, particularly if you're vulnerable, you begin to think about it more. Oh, if they could do it, I could do it. It's rare, but research says emotional contagion is real and we need to intervene to prevent it. And if you're a part of the media community, if you're a part of doing articles in the media, whether it's print media or whether it's social media, we need to be very careful about the language we use and how we talk about it. We need to talk about it, but we need to talk about it with safe language. Next. Our teenagers and our young adults are particularly prone, they're very vulnerable to contagion. And there's the sensational media reporting, which we'll talk about later. Next, please. Now, there are such things, though, as protective factors, right? Risk puts you at risk. Warning says, please pay attention to me now. But the more of the things on this list that you have, they insulate us. They keep us healthy. They reduce the impact and the effects of multiple ACEs. I'll save that for you to look for when you can access the PowerPoint. Next, please. How do you do this, George? How do you connect? I get scared with the idea of talking to somebody who is suicidal. Number one, if your gut says you're worried, then listen to what they have to say. People who are suicidal want someone to listen. Observe their behavior and comment about it. I notice you've been more irritable recently. I notice you've been drinking more recently. I'm worried. Are you having thoughts that put you at risk? Pay attention to that gut. Don't dismiss it. Don't dismiss your gut reaction at all. That's got a good brain connection down there. Ask them directly. Don't be afraid. You know, talking to somebody about their suicidal thinking or asking them doesn't plant the seed and doesn't make them make an attempt. In fact, what it does is it slows everything down because the message is, I see things, I hear things, I'm worried about you. Can we talk about them? Are you having thoughts of taking your own life? Stay away from the phrase, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? Because that sounds like self-injury, doesn't it? Are you having thoughts of cutting yourself or banging your head? That's not what we mean here. We can use the direct words, are you having thoughts of taking your own life? Are you having thoughts of dying by suicide? Remain calm as you can. And if you need someone else to be with you when you talk to that person, bring somebody else into the conversation. Offer hope. Don't dismiss it as, oh, you don't want to think that way, because they do want to think that way. Oh, you don't want to do that to your mom and dad. They're not thinking about mom and dad. They're thinking about their suffering. The phrase to use is, we can get you help. I am not going to leave you alone. There are ways out of this, and I want to help you. Next slide. Don't minimize. Don't minimize by, oh, the sun will come out tomorrow. Oh, please don't do that. Because for them, they're in a suffering state. Don't minimize it. Say it must be really terrible to have those feelings. If they say, thank you for talking to me, but I promise I won't do it now. Don't rely on that promise. They're not intentionally trying to lie to you, but they may feel a little better. But because they acknowledge that they were suicidal, now we need to connect them to somebody who can help. Don't promise ever to keep their suicide story a secret. That would be a betrayal of them, because at some point you're going to need to tell somebody else. At some point you're going to need to take them to the crisis center. So don't promise to keep the suicidal conversation a secret. Don't question them about it. You have everything to live for. Why would you do that? Because in the moment, they're not thinking about living, they're thinking about dying. Don't leave them alone. Get them connected. And when you do transfer them softly with great love and great caring to another person who can help. Next slide. Asking the direct question will not make somebody suicidal. If we can hold on to our own discomfort, it's the right thing to do. It's where you slow somebody's thinking down, their feeling down, and you begin to connect them to healing. Next. So your personal intervention with somebody is affected by a lot of variables, right? And that's what we've been talking about for a half hour or so. Your personal beliefs about it. You know, suicide is not about weakness. It's about hurt and pain. People who think about suicide are not weak. People who die by suicide are not weak. They're trying to figure a way out of this dilemma that they have about the hurt. It's also not selfish. Please don't use that word with the survivors. Suicide is not about somebody being selfish. It's about somebody not knowing how to end their hurt, being too uncomfortable to ask for help. And that's why we rely on you now to intervene, to offer them help. Perhaps you're affected by your religious beliefs. All the major religions now acknowledge that suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior is about hurt, it's about illness. So therefore, a suicide death does not result in somebody going to hell. There are still some that hold on to that belief. I personally do not. That just perpetuates the trauma of the survivors. But your religious beliefs could get in the way of what you do, or your cultural values could get in the way. What we're here to say is, if you can incorporate what we're talking about into a new way of looking at it, feeling, and intervening, oh my goodness, will your whole community be healthier next? So resources. What do I do, George? I know somebody that you've reminded me of. I've thought about that myself. What do I do? Here's some resources. Next. Certainly you can call the Traumatic Loss Coalition. However, let me give you a caveat on that. Our work is in prevention, usually with groups. For instance, I've been invited by community groups in Cranford to come and do a community presentation on suicide. Traumatic Loss Coalition can help them arrange for that. We can help respond to a community. We can help respond to a school or a youth organization. We can respond to a sports team or a faith group. It's the big group that we're responding to. We don't provide counseling. But the next slide will help you. Next. This is a great resource for your young people. I'd say 10 to 24. They can either text or talk at that line, and folks on the other end will help them through a difficult time and get connected to help and support. In my practice here and in my work with kids in schools, if I'm worried about a kid, I tell them to put that phone number in their phone. Because in the midst of a terrible time at 2 a.m, they're not going to go looking for a piece of paper. I want them to go to their phone under help and hit that line, and they're going to get somebody who's going to talk them through that really difficult time. Next. This is the Helpline. That phone number there at the bottom is for all age groups, and it's a New Jersey prevention Helpline. So if somebody's suffering, if somebody's struggling with something that may lead to suicide, that's the number there to call next. This is a national number. So no matter where you might live, or perhaps you've heard something tonight and you've got family and friends in Delaware or Texas or California, this helpline, this number, national. Anybody can call from anywhere in the country and get connected. Next. I like this. This is it's a New Jersey group. It's a Warrior Moms group. If some of you would like to volunteer to help, what this group does is they have done, I think it's pretty amazing. They have put together, they're called bags of comfort and hope, that if you've got to go to the ER because of a suicide attempt or the crisis because of a suicide attempt, in certain hospitals in New Jersey, when you arrive, you get a bag of comfort and hope. And in it are notepads so you can take notes. In it are things to help you keep calm. There might be some cush balls to get rid of your stress. It are things there to help somebody get through the difficult time leading up to your assessment. Email them, look them up, Warrior Group Mom. Maybe you can volunteer to help. Next. These are online resources. The TLC is very connected to American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the AFSP. At the bottom is the the second one is the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. If you need more information, go to those websites. Those sites will provide you information that can fill in the gaps that perhaps you have after this presentation. Next. This is a download that I happen to like, and let me just explain it for a bit. If you're a counselor in the community, please get to know this app, because if you have suicidal clients, you're going to want them to download it and put it in their phone. Because when you open it up, this is not at a time of crisis that you open it up first. When you download it, you fill in all personal information about yourself. How do I know when I'm in trouble? What are the behaviors that I notice in myself? Who are my go-to people? What helps me to calm down? It lays it out in a way that if you're in crisis and you go to your phone and open up this safety app, you can actually soothe yourself until you can get connected to somebody. It's available for all of those as you see it. Download it. It's free. It's a very valuable. If you're a mom or dad, talk with your children about it. Look at it first yourself. Have a conversation about it. If you need the school counselor to help, reach out to the school counselor next. These are media guidelines that I won't go through, but I can tell you this. If you're in the business of media, if you write about community events, including suicide deaths, if you do it in the print media, the online media, if you do it on social media, it is very important that you follow these guidelines. Here's the reason why. If you talk about it in ways that are not safe, you actually perpetuate the problem. You actually can stir up with the graphic stories you tell or the graphic pictures you show. You could stir up others that are viewing your website or your blog or reading your paper. The language is really important. We have to also always add resources at the very end of the story. The story is an important story, but we don't want to exploit people. We don't want to exploit families, and we need to offer resources. The TLC number there is for you in the media business to give them a call. Give us a call at that number so we can tune you in to the guidelines for media next. Self-care. This is where you get a chance to take care of yourself first and foremost, always. If you've had suicidal thinking in your past or your own mental health struggles really makes you particularly sad and deeply depressed or anxious, then first of all, what we need to talk about is what is your body trying to tell you and what can you do? There are really 3 critically important things. Number 1, sleep. If your sleep is regularly and chronically disrupted, your whole internal system is going to be thrown off, and it will increase all your risk-taking behavior. Nutrition. Good food, not absence of food, or not just carb food. I'm going to go down to the 4th one there, exercise. That's actually the 3rd. I need to move that up on the slide. You need to move your body in walking and running and playing basketball and doing yoga and biking, things that in fact get rid of the excess toxic stress that's being held in your body. Your sleep, your nutrition, your exercise. Drink water, hydrate. It'll flush out excess stress hormones. If you pray, pray. If you use relaxation skills, if you meditate already, use meditation, use your yoga. Avoid or reduce alcohol, caffeine, and other substances. And by all means, self-care means going to someone you trust and saying, I'm in real trouble, can you help me? Practice and role model, both for yourself and for your children, others in your family, and in the community, self-care next. So working together, we can create environments where our kids, and for our other adult family members that promotes health and healing. We need to get realigned with doing healthy practices next. You know, I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that. Then I realized, well, I'm somebody. You know, we're recognizing that with COVID. Let me bring COVID into the conversation. Let me bring protests into the conversation, regardless of what your politics are. Let me bring that in, because what we know is, as human beings, regardless of your other persuasions, regardless of your politics, regardless of your gender, regardless of your color, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless, we all have human needs. And right now we are under immense stress within our communities. Some families more so than others. Some families began fragile, and now they're even more fragile. We can no longer wait for somebody else to step up and say, I'll do my part. I'll ask. I'll drive you to the hospital. I'll connect you with your mom or dad. I'll sit and listen to you because I know it's difficult. I will take on that role because I am somebody, and somebody else may need me. I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that. Well, I'm the somebody. Next. So if not you, and if not me, then who's going to do it? Who are we waiting for? Who's going to step up and help our kids, our babies, our kids in elementary, middle, and high school, our older children? Who's going to do that? Because actually it's up to each of us. You, personally, me, it's up to us to make a difference. Next. So you're not alone. The future can be hopeful when you're connected. Finding a trusted adult to lean on. Being able to share your story and not being afraid of your own tears. Not being afraid to say that you think you're depressed or that you have an immense amount of anxiety. You know, on the lighter side, on the kind of the, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether this is funny or not. As adults, as older adults, you and I are more likely to tell somebody about the results of our colonoscopy than we are the results of our evaluation by a therapist or a psychiatrist, because there's so much stigma about mental illness. Imagine the difference. Something so personal as a colonoscopy takes precedence over wellness about emotion. You're not alone. There is hope. And working together like you are tonight as a community is such a good way to do it. Last slide, please. So this is me. This is my contact information. So my two big roles in the state are for the Traumatic Loss Coalition as a resource coordinator statewide, and then down here in Mercer County, where I do not only I have a practice here with my wife and some other counselors here in Mercer, but I also get out and do other group meetings where I help parents understand this and maybe understand ACEs better and what they can do around ACEs and around suicidal worry. So you can reach out to me there at that email address. You could call me there at the practice. I'll get back to you, because what I don't want is I don't want you to have a need or a question and you don't have access to help. I'm not in your community, although I've gotten to have great respect for Cranford, but I will make sure that we, in fact, get you connected. And I know Detective Matt has other personal resources for your area. I just want me to be one of those. So let me say this, and I know we'll have time in a little bit for some Q&A. I didn't hesitate to say yes to this. This is really important. And here's one of the things that's happening. When people are fragile, like when we went into COVID in February, and then we get locked down, We have seen a reduction in suicidal behavior because people are with each other. But my fear is if you don't seek good professional help, community help, help from somebody that you love and that you trust, my fear is people are going to get overwhelmed the longer this continues. We need to pay attention to each other. That's the humanity in us. So I want to thank you so much for having me be a part of this community experience. And I look forward to either more work together in the future or perhaps answering some questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Scott. Greatly appreciate all you've done for us this evening. On behalf of the Cranford JCs, I just want to say thank you once again for shedding your light and insight into mental health and suicide crisis in the world today, and actually helping our Cranford community open the conversation, which we know is so important. We will make sure we make the slides available from this presentation on our website, cranfordjcs.org, for reference and usage. And as I think I referenced earlier in the evening, this session is actually being recorded live with TV 35, so that will be there for future use on their website and through simulcast capabilities as well for re-listening and retuning in. Next, I'd like to welcome into the program here Detective Sergeant Matt Nazaro from the Cranford Police Department, who will share with us some local resources and programs we have available within our school system and community for assistance. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I want to thank, on behalf of the Cranford Police Department, the Cranford JCs, the Manning family, George Scott, all for making this evening's event possible for our community. It's a tremendous opportunity for all of us to do a little self-reflection and also be reminded of things that we can do probably better day in, day out, especially in light of our current state of affairs in our country and on a local level. One of the biggest points of pride in the Cranford Police Department is that we have one of the highest amounts of crisis intervention trained officers in Union County. Couple that with a Cranford public school system that really focuses on student wellness, especially in the counseling department led by Mrs. Lisa Bernfeit and the Cranford Board of Education, the Cranford Public Schools. That partnership with the Cranford Police Department and the Township Committee has really made it so that we are a one-stop for all types of resources on a local level, in addition to what Mr. Scott detailed. On an anonymous level, if you do want to report something in the schools and you are our student, we have our Stop It app through the Cranford Public Schools. That is an ability for you to report something 24/7. An administrator will see it. So if we do see someone that's hurting or in need of immediate assistance and attention, the Stop It app is available through Cranford Public Schools. And on the police department side, for the Township of Cranford, our Nixle app is another means to anonymously report things to a trusted ear so that we can get that individual or that problem some attention that it may need. One of the things that we've posted on our website at cranfordnj.org/police-department is a family resource guide that's from the Cranford Juvenile Bureau. It has all resources on a local level, whether it's Care in Contact on the top right of that family resource guide, Trinitas Hospital mobile screening, whether it's Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, teens wanting to talk to other teens. There's a tremendous amount of local resources that Prevention Links put into one family resource guide, and it is available 24/7 on our website at cranfordnj.org/police-department. In addition to that, I would recommend that if families are having a crisis in their home involving a juvenile, performcarenewjersey.org is a great resource, and it's a parent-driven assistance for families in crisis. As always, the Cranford Police Department Juvenile Bureau is here to answer any follow-up questions or concerns you may have regarding tonight's presentation or something maybe that's been looming. We are not clinicians, but we know how to connect you with those individuals that will get you into trusted company and follow the next steps of corrective action and treatment, and really giving the attention necessary to combat any personal issues that you're seeing, whether it's in your household, your extended friendships, whatever. We're looking for each other in this community, and this is an opportunity for us to look out for one another. And last but not least, cranfordschools.org. If you look at the Cranford Counseling Quarter, the counseling department for the Cranford Public School System, second to none with our counseling staff, and they have a tremendous amount of resources from kindergarten up to 12th grade. Not all things can be fixed one way, in one specific way, and they have really catered it to the age bracket, whether it's elementary, high school level, They've really broken down resources that are age appropriate for you, your child, and your household should the need arise. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call the Cranford Police Department Juvenile Bureau. And of course, if you ever have an emergency 24/7, call the Cranford Police Department at 908-272-2222. Even if the Juvenile Bureau is not there, we have amazing men and women trained especially to deal with all types of crises should that unfortunately arise. So Joe, I'll turn it back over to you, and thank you all for being a part of tonight's presentation.
Great, thanks, Matt. I mean, it's amazing the amount of resources we have locally. It's just a matter of making sure we make use of them. So hopefully what we've done here this evening is made you aware of those. As we said, they're going to be on our website as well. But, you know, as Matt referenced, do not hesitate to reach out for assistance and help should and when, if the need arises. Now I'd kind of like to move it on to our second part of the program. Actually, this basically concludes the formal part of our presentation. And then now I'd like to welcome all of you to join the Zoom meeting, which should be hopefully showing up on the screen here in the chat session as well, for a non-recorded interactive Q&A session with Dr. George Scott and Detective DeZaro. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. The Cranford JCs look forward to continuing the conversation and collaborating with the community on raising awareness on mental health and suicide prevention. We'll be opening up the Zoom momentarily, so I hope to see all of you there. If not, stay well, be well, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much.